In the dark of Lochdu, an old promise between Hamish Macbeth and Priscilla resurfaces, pulling him into quiet trouble. Some vows refuse to stay buried. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. The mist had rolled in off Lochdu before dawn, a wet, curling thing that settled into the village with quiet insistence. Hamish Macbeth, lanky and red-haired as ever, moved along the shoreline with lugs padding silently at his side. The dog's ears flicked at every sound, the faint splash of water against the jetties, the distant cough of a crofter lighting a peat fire, the scrape of oars against a mooring post. The air smelled sharply of damp earth and salt, with a whisper of peat smoke drifting from chimneys. The village was just waking. Windows glowed dimly in the mist, figures moved through narrow lanes, and a kettle whistled somewhere in a stone cottage. Hamish tucked his coat tighter and sniffed at the cold, the sensation reminding him that he had left his own fire low in the kitchen hearth. He glanced at Lugs, whose nose twitched in the fog. "Easy, boy," he murmured. The dog paused, ears erect, watching the water. Shadows moved oddly in the low light, and the reeds along the loch whispered in the wind. Hamish's eyes followed footprints pressed into the soft mud, larger than a child's, smaller than a fisherman's, and a frown tugged at his lips. Someone had walked this path recently, but not someone he knew. Further along, Patel's shop rattled as the door swung open and the shopkeeper peered out, muttering a greeting to anyone who might notice. The Curry sisters, arm in arm, whispered from their doorway, their heads tilting with the practiced curiosity that Hamish knew well. They caught sight of him, murmured something, then turned away as if embarrassed, though Hamish was certain they had passed along half a dozen new theories about strangers in the village before sunrise. A fishing boat, tethered loosely at the jetty, bobbed oddly, its prow dipping and rising more than usual. Hamish's eyes narrowed. He recognized the boat, had seen it launched the day before, and yet something felt wrong. He moved closer, Lugs following without a sound. Water lapped quietly at the planks. The boat was empty, mooring ropes slack and tangled, and a small net lay abandoned on the bench. He squatted, peering into the gloom. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but the emptiness itself felt deliberate, almost too tidy for the usual careless arrangements of a crofter's gear. "Morning, Hamish," called a voice from the far side of the loch. A fisherman emerged from the mist, dripping from the jetty. His hands gestured vaguely at the water. "Thought you'd want to see this." He led Hamish to another boat, a smaller dinghy, its bow swinging loosely on the tide. Something was lodged beneath it, a pack or bundle, judging by the uneven shape. Hamish crouched again. It was a coat, soaked, heavier than it should have been, floating just below the surface. He jabbed the water gently with a stick. It didn't sink, didn't drift with the tide. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides, and he felt the familiar prickle of unease that always came when something didn't fit. Lugs let out a low growl, ears flat, tail stiff. Hamish laid a calming hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, boy. Nothing to bite yet." He studied the water, the reeds, the faint lights of the village beyond. Something had happened here, something small in itself but significant to those involved. Already, whispers were beginning to circulate in his mind. Who had been on the loch? Who might have noticed? And what could they not say? By the time he returned to the village path, the post office had opened and a few crofters carried baskets toward the shore, exchanging curt greetings with one another. Hamish noticed their glances, quick, calculated, half fearful. Pride and old grudges lay thick in the village, and any hint of outsiders or unusual activity could stir them to gossip or thinly veiled hostility. He saw it in the way Mrs. Curry shifted her weight, in the twitch of a hotel owner's hand as he adjusted the strap on a delivery bag. Hamish absorbed it all, quiet, gentle, taking mental notes. He wandered toward Patel's shop, exchanging brief words about weather and prices, all the while noting the subtle changes in the village. The tourist carriage had taken a new route today, ruffling the pride of the crofters whose fields it skirted. Small, half-hidden resentments clung to the air like the mist itself. Hamish made a note of the change in timing at the Kirk Hall and the absence of a regular early fisher who might have seen the boats late last night. Nothing concrete yet, but a pattern was forming, as patterns always did if one was patient. A sudden clatter from the hotel yard drew his gaze. Blair and Daviot, Strathbane officers, were making their presence known, shouting, stamping through puddles, and generally causing more confusion than clarity. Blair waved a notebook as if it could impose order on the fog, while Daviot fussed with his hat and muttered about procedure. Hamish's lips twitched in dry amusement. Their officiousness, clumsy and ill-informed, irritated him more than any actual danger. Lugs barked softly at their approach, retreating a step behind Hamish's legs. Priscilla Halberton Smythe appeared then, stepping lightly along the cobbled street from the hotel doorway. She wore a muted coat, her hair arranged carefully, as if mist and wind could not touch her elegance. Her gaze swept over the village, over Hamish, and lingered for a brief second longer than necessary. He felt that quiet tension coil in his chest, a mixture of warmth, longing, and the impossible distance between them. She offered a polite nod, serene and calm, and turned her attention back to the hotel, leaving Hamish to his thoughts. By mid-morning, more villagers had begun to assemble near the loch, curiosity subdued beneath polite conversation. Hamish spoke quietly with the fisherman who had found the bundle, asking gentle, precise questions while observing glances, hesitations, and the faint twitch of shoulders betraying unspoken truths. Lugg sat at his feet, ears rotating, tail brushing the pebbles, alert to every nuance. Hamish's mind worked in short, careful steps. Who had been on the loch, what had been left behind, and what the village was willing or unwilling to admit. The mist began to lift slightly, revealing the dark, calm water and the outlines of cottages along the shore. Hamish walked slowly back along the shoreline, Lugs beside him, taking in the rhythm of village life. A child running after a dog, a crofter hauling nets, Patel arranging small displays outside his shop. Every detail mattered, every slight movement and glance offered a clue, and he stored them quietly. He knew that, by afternoon, gossip would begin to circulate, and small truths would be twisted in the telling. It was only by patient observation and gentle inquiry that clarity could emerge. Hamish stopped at the edge of the loch, letting the faint chill seep through his coat. Lugs padded beside him, nose to the ground, then looked up at him with eyes that asked the same questions Hamish had been asking himself. He exhaled slowly, the sound lost in the damp air, and already he felt the subtle hum of mystery settling into the rhythm of Loch Dhu. Somewhere among the villagers, the answers waited. Somewhere in the mist, the truth was bobbing quietly, as elusive as the ripples on the water. He gave Lugs a pat, and together they turned toward the village, aware that the day would stretch long, full of observation, gossip, and the small steps of investigation that Hamish favoured above all else. The loch lay calm behind them, the mist curling slowly toward the hills, and the first threads of the story were beginning to weave themselves into the familiar, melancholic tapestry of Loch Dhu life. Later that same morning, the mist lingered stubbornly over Loch Dhu, curling around the cottages and clinging to the hotel's slate roof like a reluctant guest. Hamish Macbeth walked beside Lugs, whose low growls punctuated the silence as they approached the quay. The abandoned boat from the day before had stirred the village into a cautious flurry, and whispers had already reached the post office, the Curry sisters, and the fishers mending their nets along the shore. There was an air of hushed expectation, an undercurrent of curiosity that carried through the mist in small, flickering movements, a hotel bell jingling, a door opening just long enough for a nervous servant to peek out, a cart rattling over wet cobbles. Hamish inhaled the damp, peaty scent and felt the familiar pull of instinct. Something was amiss, and the village was quietly waiting for him to notice. At the hotel, the front steps glistened with rain, and the doorman shuffled nervously, eyes darting from Hamish to the street. Lugs sniffed the damp flagstones, tail low, and let out a tentative whine. Hamish gave the dog's neck a reassuring pat. "Steady, boy. Nothing yet." Inside, the lobby smelled of polished wood and faint bleach, mingling oddly with the lingering aroma of damp coats. The maid, a pale young woman with anxious eyes, hovered near the reception desk, wringing a cloth. She glanced at Hamish and Lugs, then at the hall leading to the upper floors, lips pressed together as if she had rehearsed exactly what not to say. Hamish nodded gently. "Good morning. I'm looking for Mr. Withers," he said. His voice carried calm authority, unobtrusive but observant. The maid's fingers paused mid-ring, and her eyes flicked to the staircase. "Hasn't come down," she murmured. "No breakfast yet." Hamish's gaze drifted toward the corridor, noting the heavy curtains still drawn across the windows of Mr. Withers' room, the untouched luggage near the bed visible through the half-open door. Nothing seemed forcibly moved, yet the stillness was conspicuous, almost deliberate. He crouched briefly to examine Luggs's reactions. The dog's hackles were slightly raised, ears swivelling toward the upper floors. There was unease in the way Luggs's nose twitched, subtle enough for strangers to miss but clear to Hamish. He rose, walking the polished corridor with quiet steps, listening to the soft creak of floorboards under his boots. "Morning," he said again, more conversationally, to the maid. "When did you last see Mr. Withers?" "Yesterday evening, sir," she replied, voice faltering. "He dined alone. Left the table before 9. She swallowed, eyes flicking toward a colleague carrying a tray. Hamish noted the slight tightening around her mouth, the way her shoulders stiffened. Something about the timing, the absence of anyone else's recollection, suggested that the story had gaps, small but telling. Downstairs, the hotel owner appeared, a stiff man in his 50s with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Detective Macbeth," he said with a nod, voice measured. "We were just concerned. Mr. Withers is a frequent guest, and he's never missed breakfast before." His hands fidgeted slightly, tapping on the edge of the desk. Hamish observed, silently noting the posture, the set of the jaw, the faint twitch in the owner's left eyebrow. Polite, cautious, but protective of his own reputation, exactly as Hamish would expect from a man in that position. Outside, the village continued its gentle stirrings. Crofters made their way to the quay, eyeing Hamish as he emerged from the hotel door. Their greetings were curt but not unfriendly, voices low, tinged with curiosity. Hamish made note of every glance, every hesitation. There was subtle competition here. Some villagers resented outsiders' influence. Others simply enjoyed the quiet thrill of a minor scandal. A young fisherman, head cocked, murmured something about seeing Mr. Withers near the loch late the previous night. Hamish made a mental note, weighing the reliability of the observation against the pride and secrecy that so often coloured villagers' accounts. Back in the hotel, the maid led Hamish to the upper corridor. Luggs's low growl intensified as they passed the guest rooms, lingering just outside Mr. Withers' door. Hamish crouched, peering inside. A small dressing table, neatly arranged, reflected the morning light faintly. The bed was untouched, though the covers were smoothed with an almost unnatural care. The luggage stood unopened, as though its owner had never intended to depart. Hamish's mind worked in small increments. Nothing forced entry, no sign of struggle, yet the absence of the guest was undeniable. Gossip began to drift through the hotel lobby like a fragile thread, some of it from tourists who had noticed oddities the previous evening, the visitor and a crofter seen speaking too long near the loch, whispers of laughter that suggested familiarity. Hamish considered the story. It might have been true, might have been exaggeration, but he weighed it against the practical evidence. No belongings moved, no signs of private rendezvous. The red herring presented itself naturally, tempting the eye but failing under measured scrutiny. Blair arrived mid-morning, stamping into the lobby with all the subtlety of a landing crane. Davitt followed, adjusting his hat, while Anderson hovered close, attempting to mimic authority. Blair began issuing orders before anyone had spoken, insisting on checks, inventories, and forms that Hamish knew would accomplish nothing. Hamish smiled faintly, dry and inward, observing their procedural chaos. Luggs growled quietly at the approaching group, the dog sensing a vicious intrusion more keenly than any subtle clue Hamish could articulate. Hamish turned to the hotel owner. "Would you mind telling me who had access to Mr. Withers' room yesterday evening?" His voice was soft, insistent but unthreatening. The owner hesitated, brow furrowing, then listed staff with careful attention to appearances and responsibilities. Every pause and glance communicated pride, embarrassment, and a touch of fear, all of which Hamish catalogued. Small, human details that would never appear in Strathbane's reports but were essential to understanding the village. Outside, the mist had lifted slightly, revealing the dark gleam of Loch Dhu. The wind carried scents of seaweed, wet stone, and peat smoke. Hamish walked the quay with Luggs, listening to the gulls, noting the subtle disturbances in the mud, the footprints along the edge of the loch. Villagers drifted past, murmuring behind hands, sharing information that was incomplete, distorted, or exaggerated, but all useful. He pieced together the last sightings of the visitor, noting small inconsistencies, tiny hesitations, and the pride or shame that made people lie in half-truths. By mid-morning, Hamish had collected a tapestry of information: observations from the fisher, subtle revelations from hotel staff, half-whispered accounts from villagers, and the occasional incongruous remark from tourists. Lugs trotted alongside, ears swivelling, nose low, alert to movement and tone. Hamish's mind worked quietly, drawing connections, discarding the improbable, and recognizing the human need for protection, reputation, and dignity. He returned to the hotel briefly, catching Priscilla in the lobby. She moved with her usual elegance, hands clasped, eyes serene. Hamish felt the familiar tension stir, a combination of admiration, longing, and quiet exasperation at the distance between them. She spoke briefly with the maid, voice measured, attentive. Hamish noted the subtle shift in posture, the faint relaxation as she acknowledged the problem without dramatic display. He remained a few steps behind, observing, listening, and taking in the tableau of calm professionalism layered over worry and unspoken fears. Blair, exasperated, demanded immediate results, but Hamish held his patience, allowing the officer's impatience to expose assumptions and errors. He guided the conversation subtly, emphasizing human details, timing, and observation over paperwork. Slowly, the picture began to take shape. Mr. Withers had not left the village by accident, nor had he been forcibly removed in any obvious way. There were choices, motivations, and errors, but nothing violent, nothing beyond the cosy scale of Highland mystery. By late morning, Hamish stepped back onto the quay with Lugs at his side. The mist had thinned further, revealing the gentle curl of waves on the loch, the creaking of mooring posts, and the rhythmic splash of water against boats. Villagers moved about their routines, eyes occasionally flicking toward the hotel, toward Hamish, toward the loch itself. Small truths, gossip, and human quirks were beginning to clarify the outline of events, though the full story remained tucked beneath the surface. Hamish exhaled, the air cold in his lungs, and felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and quiet melancholy. Lugs nudged his hand, a reminder that the day was only beginning, and that every detail, every glance, and every whisper mattered. Somewhere in the village, somewhere in the corridors of the hotel and along the loch, answers were waiting. Patience, observation, and subtle persuasion would reveal them. And for now he walked on, the mist curling around his boots, the loch spreading its dark, reflective calm beside him, and the village quietly humming with the day's emerging mystery. By late morning, mist still lingered over Loch Dhu, curling in lazy spirals around rooftops and drifting down the narrow streets where villagers had begun their daily routines. Hamish Macbeth walked with Lugs at his heels, boots damp from the soft mud of the quayside. The dog's ears twitched constantly, alert to every shift in the wind, every scrape of a shutter, the faint scuff of a boot along the stone. Hamish inhaled the cold, bracing air, tasting the faint salt of the loch mingled with the tang of peat smoke from chimneys. It was the sort of morning that made gossip feel more urgent, more necessary, as though the village itself needed to fill the silence with voices. The Curry sisters were already gathered at the corner of their house, peering down the street. Their heads tilted toward each other, eyes narrowing and bright with curiosity. Hamish paused, leaning on the low stone wall. They caught sight of him and lowered their voices, murmuring, glances flicking to the hotel. He heard only fragments. "Did you see?" And "I heard," but that was enough. They passed along half-truths, speculation, and misremembered details, as was their habit, and Hamish catalogued it quietly, storing the subtle cues for later. Lugs sniffed the air and growled softly, ears flat. Something about the way a tourist lingered at the hotel entrance, taking notes in a stiff manner, put the dog on alert. Hamish allowed himself a moment to observe the tourists. They spoke quietly to one another, stiff, formal, eyes wide with curiosity, unaware that they were inadvertently stirring tension among the villagers. A young couple hesitated near Patel's shop, peering over baskets of produce with obvious indecision. Crofters passed by with blunt greetings, frowning at the visitors' hesitance as though pride were wounded by their caution. Hamish smiled faintly at the scene, dry amusement warming the chill in his chest. Gossip and pride were as intertwined in Loch Dhu as mist and water. At the post office, the minister emerged quietly, exchanging polite greetings with villagers. Hamish noted the careful phrasing of his words, the way he offered half-truths in conversation, as if managing the flow of information without exposing too much. The minister's eyes flicked toward Hamish, holding his gaze a fraction longer than necessary, suggesting awareness without intrusion. Hamish returned the glance with measured neutrality, noting the subtle communication. Some truths must be uncovered, some protected. Lugs padded beside him, tail low, sniffing at the damp stones. Hamish adjusted his frayed jacket, smelling faintly of peat smoke and tea, and thought of the small comforts waiting at home. The kettle would be on the hob, waiting to whistle, and the fire would still be faintly warm from the night before. He felt a pull of solitude, the quiet weight of personal reflection pressing gently against the day's unfolding mystery. Priscilla's brief trip to the city earlier in the week made his chest tighten slightly, a reminder of a promise he had made and the distance between intention and circumstance. He tucked the thought away, focusing instead on the village and its human subtleties. Muttered in corners and overheard at the Kirk Hall, Hamish stopped by a group of crofters hauling nets toward the loch. "Did anyone see Mr. Withers last night?" he asked casually, letting his tone carry no judgment. The men glanced at each other, one shrugging, another muttering about a shadow moving along the shore. Small contradictions emerged immediately, revealing pride, shame, and the subtle competitiveness that defined these long-standing relationships. One crofter, stout and weathered, noted that he had seen someone near the hotel late, but he could not confirm it was the visitor. The hesitation, the careful avoidance of certainty, spoke volumes. Hamish moved on toward the hotel, noting the small domestic details of life that grounded the day. Smoke drifted from chimneys, curling around roof lines and mixing with the persistent mist. The scent of brewing tea reached him from an open window, warm and comforting against the chill. A baker carried a basket of fresh rolls past, and the rhythmic clatter of carts over wet cobbles echoed faintly. Each ordinary moment, observed and catalogued, provided a frame against which unusual events could be measured. Lugs wagged his tail slightly, sensing the village's subtle tension as well as the faint unease in the hotel corridors. Inside the hotel, Hamish spoke with staff and guests, letting questions flow naturally while observing posture, tone, and micro-expressions. The maid's hands fidgeted with a towel as she recounted Mr. Withers' evening, eyes flicking nervously toward the stairs. The hotel owner hovered in the background, stiff, polite, his jaw tight, every movement hinting at the pride of maintaining appearances. Hamish listened, quietly parsing the human details, noting what was said, what was avoided, and what seemed impossible to hide. Fear, pride, and secret knowledge simmered just beneath the surface. Blair arrived with his usual clatter, voice raised and imperious, insisting on formalities that Hamish knew would achieve nothing. Daviot followed, glancing around, adjusting his tie, speaking in half-measured tones. Anderson shadowed their movements, nodding at each pronouncement as though it contained some authority. Hamish allowed the officers to flounder, observing their impatience, their lack of subtlety, their disregard for the human nuance of Loch Dhu life. Lugs gave a low growl at the trio, ears flat, and Hamish patted the dog's head, letting the presence of the bureaucrat serve as a convenient distraction while he worked quietly. Returning to the quay, Hamish retraced the visitor's last known movements, speaking gently with crofters and villagers alike. Half-truths, misremembered times, and conflicting accounts formed a tangled pattern, and Hamish sifted through them with patience. He noticed subtle rivalries, a hotel employee who disliked the maid, a crofter who resented the hotel's attention to visitors, and tourists oblivious to the tensions they exacerbated. Every gesture, hesitation, and glance was a clue. As the day progressed, Hamish found a moment to pause by the loch. Lugg sat at his side, head tilted, ears alert to movement along the shore. The mist shifted, curling around the wooden jetties and damp rocks, and Hamish let his mind wander quietly. Reflections of clouds on the water, faint ripples, the distant cry of gulls, all settled his thoughts, even as he considered motives. Pride, jealousy, financial gain, and personal embarrassment. Every villager's small secret could tip the balance. Every misremembered word could mislead. Priscilla's presence lingered in his thoughts, gentle and restrained, a quiet contrast to the bustle and noise around him. Hamish allowed himself a moment to imagine her calm composure, elegant and untroubled, while he pieced together the village's social puzzle. Lugs nudged his hand, a reminder of the present, of observation, and of the work still unfolding. The village, the mist, the loch, and the slow circulation of human whispers all demanded patience. By afternoon, the threads of gossip and observation were beginning to form a discernible picture. Hamish understood the village, its protective instincts, its petty rivalries, and the subtleties of human pride and shame. Blair's intrusion was clumsy but predictable, and Daviot's fussing did nothing to aid clarity. The visitor was still unaccounted for, but the outlines of motive, opportunity, and human error were beginning to emerge. Hamish breathed in the cold loch air, letting the mist curl around his coat, and felt the quiet certainty that observation and gentle questioning would uncover the truth. Lugg stayed at his side, ears pricked, tail brushing wet cobbles, an anchor to reality and emotion alike. The light was softening as afternoon began to lean toward evening, casting long shadows over the misty streets and darkening the loch to a grey-black sheen. Hamish straightened his coat and walked back toward the village, Lugs following. Voices drifted from the post office and the Kirk Hall, some tentative, some sharp with curiosity. The day's reflections, rumours, and careful observations had begun to clarify the human terrain of the mystery, but the resolution remained distant. The village hummed quietly with anticipation, each whisper, glance, and hesitation a part of the puzzle. Hamish allowed himself a small smile. The threads were coming together, slowly, delicately, and the loch's mist seemed to hold its breath with him. That afternoon the mist lay heavy on the moors, curling over the hummocks of heather and clinging to every tuft of grass as if reluctant to let go. Hamish Macbeth moved quietly, boots sinking slightly in the soft, damp earth, with Lugs padding at his side, ears flicking at every distant sound. The wind carried a faint tang of salt from Loch Dhu, mingling with the earthy scent of peat and wet stone. Midges swarmed lazily in the mist, their persistence annoying, yet Hamish welcomed the distraction, a small companion to the quiet solitude. Each step across the moor revealed subtle changes in the landscape, tracks partially washed by overnight drizzle, broken branches that might once have been overlooked, and depressions in the soil hinting at hurried movement. Hamish crouched briefly to examine one footprint, tracing the pattern with his boot. The print was faint, softened by rain, yet the angle suggested someone had hurried, slipping slightly on the wet earth as they crossed a small stream. He straightened and exhaled quietly, aware of Lugs's low growl beside him. "Steady, boy," he murmured. The dog's instincts always caught what Hamish's eyes might miss, the subtle tension in the environment that heralded trouble or the presence of someone unseen. Hamish scanned the horizon, noting the way mist rolled down toward the loch, swallowing the path behind him. The moors were alive in a quiet, insistent way. Heather trembled under the weight of water, and small streams swollen from rain burbled past, carrying dark reflections of the low clouds above. Hamish allowed himself a moment to breathe in the stillness. Walking the moors always helped him think. The isolation, the wind in his hair, the faint sound of Lugs's paws against wet earth, it sharpened his senses, clarified his thoughts. He considered the day ahead, the missing visitor, and the threads of gossip weaving through the village. The pull of Loch Dhu, its familiar faces, and his quiet duty to protect its secrets tugged at him, even as he wondered about the world beyond the hills. A crofter appeared then, coming along a narrow path that cut through the heather. Broad-shouldered and weathered, he stopped abruptly upon seeing Hamish. His hands, calloused and slightly trembling, rested on his hips. "You're out early," the crofter said, voice flat but watchful. His eyes darted to Lugs, then back to Hamish, assessing, cautious. Hamish inclined his head politely. "Morning. I'm retracing Mr. Wither's steps from last night. Did you see anyone moving this way?" The crofter's frown deepened. "Nay," he said after a pause. "Can't say I did, but I'm minding my own, ye ken." The hesitation, the tightness in his jaw, and the quick glance toward a far ridge told Hamish more than the words themselves. Pride and old grudges lingered in the crofter's tone. The man was protective, wary of outsiders, and likely withholding details he deemed irrelevant or inconvenient. Hamish made a note, letting the silence speak as much as conversation. The moor stretched endlessly ahead, grey and mist-wrapped. Hamish and Luggs moved on, each step revealing small, telling signs, a snapped twig here, a shallow indentation there. He observed the rhythm of footprints, discerning patterns that suggested someone had paused, reconsidered, or been startled. His mind catalogued every possibility, every minor irregularity. Luggs's soft growls punctuated the analysis, a reminder that instinct was sometimes more reliable than observation alone. A sudden sound, the distant rattle of a car over washed-out roads, drew Hamish's attention. Blair returned to the area, his vehicle rattling over the stones, jostling over the stones. The contrast was comical. The car bounced, wheels skidding slightly, Blair himself gesticulating wildly, Daviot adjusting his hat, and Anderson leaning forward in an attempt to appear useful. Hamish watched with dry amusement, noting the officer's impatience and officiousness. Luggs barked once, low and wary, his hackles rising. Hamish murmured, "Easy, boy. Just noise." Blair leapt from the vehicle, boots muddy, coat skewed. "Macbeth," he called, voice sharp and impatient. "We've been sent to assist, and we need details. Now." His expression suggested annoyance rather than helpfulness. Hamish inclined his head slightly. "Good morning. We've found tracks leading across the moor. Small signs of hurried passage, nothing violent. Perhaps we should examine them before jumping to conclusions." Daviot nodded, polite but stiff, while Anderson shuffled behind, fumbling with a notebook as if to record every word. Hamish allowed them a few minutes to observe, knowing the officers would misinterpret almost everything. The trio's officiousness highlighted what Hamish already understood. Patience and subtle observation were essential, not forms or commands. He watched the crofter from a distance, noting the man's continued defensive posture, and saw the small interplay of pride and shame, protective instincts, and grudges that defined Loch Dubh's social fabric. The wind picked up, curling mist in eddies around the hummocks of heather. Hamish crouched to inspect a partially submerged footprint near a stream. It was shallow, blurred by rain, but enough to suggest a hurried step, a pause, and a possible misstep. He traced the pattern with his gloved hand. "Curious," he murmured, to no one but himself and Luggs. The dog sniffed along the bank, tail low but alert, eyes bright with attention. As they moved onward, Hamish reflected briefly on the loneliness of his work. The moor was beautiful, the isolation restorative, yet it reminded him of the distance between his own life and the broader world. Village duties, village protection, and the quiet management of human flaws filled his days, leaving little room for personal indulgence. He thought of Priscilla, elegant and restrained, far away in the city, and of the promise he had made. It weighed lightly, persistently, as he considered the choices and motives of those who moved within Loch Dubh's delicate social balance. A sudden noise, a snapping branch behind them, made Luggs stiffen, hackles rising. Hamish turned slowly, surveying the moor. Nothing was visible beyond the mist, yet the tension was tangible. He shifted slightly, ensuring the dog stayed close, ears alert. The potential for minor danger, a stumble or surprise encounter, existed, but remained safely within the bounds of the cosy and the human, never threatening beyond observation and caution. The moor seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching along with him. By mid-morning, Hamish had traced the path as far as a small rise overlooking the loch. The tracks faded into softer soil, and the mist shifted, revealing dark water lapping gently at the edges of the shore below. Luggs padded forward, nose low, sniffing the ground. Hamish allowed himself a moment to survey the panorama, rolling grey hills, the glint of water in the morning light, and the interplay of mist and shadow across the moor. Everything had a purpose, a subtle cue, a message hidden in plain sight. He began the slow descent back toward the village, noting each detail, every shadow, every interruption in the rhythm of footprints. Social tensions, village pride, and grudges simmered invisibly, guiding who had spoken, who had withheld, and who had spoken too freely. The moor itself, damp, grey, and insistent, pressed upon him with quiet authority. Every step required attention, patience, and empathy. Luggs remained at his side, a a constant and faithful companion, sensitive to subtle movements, moods, and the unspoken nuances that defined human behavior. As he neared the edges of the village, the mist began to thin, light glimmering on the slate roofs and damp cobbles. Crofters were tending to morning chores, fishers preparing nets, and tourists drifted uncertainly, eyes wide and curious. Hamish exhaled, feeling the familiar blend of melancholy and satisfaction. The day's observations had yielded clues, small but telling, while the village's human subtleties, pride, jealousy, and careful protective instincts were becoming clearer. The moor had spoken in whispers and tracks, and Hamish had listened. He gave Lugs a pat, the dog brushing against his legs, ears flicking once more toward the fading mist. The path ahead led back to the village, where gossip, subtle confrontation, and the slow unravelling of mystery awaited. Hamish stepped forward, boots wet and coat damp, absorbing the cold Highland air, knowing that each careful observation and patient question would bring him closer to understanding, one small clue at a time. The moor's silence seemed to follow, a quiet witness to his work, and a reminder of the vigilance required in Loch Dhu. The fog had thickened by mid-morning, rolling in off Loch Dhu in curling tendrils that wrapped around cottages and clung stubbornly to the cobbled streets. Hamish Macbeth moved along the quay with Lugs at his heels, boots squelching softly in the damp. The dog's ears twitched constantly, nostrils flaring, tail low but alert. Hamish inhaled the chill air, tasting the faint tang of salt mingled with peat smoke drifting from chimneys. It was the kind of morning that encouraged quiet observation, where each breath, each movement, carried meaning if one cared to notice. Hamish had just returned from the moors, the dampness of wet heather and muddy paths still clinging to his coat. Lugs shook once, sending droplets scattering across the stones, and Hamish smiled faintly. The village was stirring, crofters moving nets toward the loch, Patel arranging baskets outside his shop, tourists lingering uncertainly near the hotel, and the Curry sisters whispering from their doorway. Every glance, every hesitation carried gossip, subtle but instructive, and Hamish catalogued it quietly as he walked. The sudden crunch of tyres on cobbles announced unwelcome visitors. A Strathbane police car bounced into view, lights muted in the fog, and soon, later in the day, Davitt and Anderson came back along the quay brisk and officious. Blair had been detained elsewhere, leaving the political officer and his sycophantic aide to manage appearances. Davitt's expression was tense, his hands adjusting his coat, fingers fidgeting with a pen. Anderson followed with a notebook, overly eager to record every word as though transcription alone could resolve the situation. Hamish inclined his head in mild greeting. "Morning. What brings you out here?" His voice carried calm authority, unobtrusive but attentive. "We require a full report, Macbeth," Davitt said sharply, glancing from the loch to Hamish. "And we need preliminary conclusions. Strathbane HQ insists on formal documentation." He tapped his notebook with a gloved finger, eyes darting nervously. Hamish raised an eyebrow, hiding the quiet amusement curling in his chest. "Formal documentation can wait," he said evenly. "I'm still gathering observations." Lugs growled softly, tail flicking. The dog sensed unease in the men's rigid posture, the kind of officious intrusion that threatened the rhythm of Loch Dhu more than any danger in the fog. Anderson leaned forward, voice tentative but eager. "We must know if there's been foul play, sir." Hamish allowed a pause, noting the man's awkward stiffness. "At this stage," he said quietly, "I prefer to follow what evidence and observation reveal. Assumptions rarely help." He gestured toward the loch. "Sometimes the best evidence comes from listening, from noticing what people do not say." Davitt's eyes flicked to the water, concern tightening his brow. "But a witness claims they saw a shadow near the loch last night. Surely that is significant." "Yes," Hamish admitted, crouching slightly to study the mist curling along the edge of the quay. "A shadow can be significant. It can also be misinterpreted. I intend to consider it carefully." Lugs sniffed the damp air, hackles rising briefly, as though confirming Hamish's caution. The village continued its quiet stirrings. Crofters glanced furtively toward the quay, hands tucked into coats against the damp, the low murmur of gossip drifting faintly through the mist. Hotel staff moved carefully, aware of the presence of outsiders and the delicate balance of propriety. Every glance, Every half-smile, every lowered voice carried a message, some obvious, some hidden. Hamish noted them all, cataloguing intention, pride, and the occasional hint of embarrassment. A tourist couple passed by, stiff and unsure, unwittingly accentuating the tension. Their whispered questions, polite but awkward, prompted furtive glances from a nearby crofter. The interaction, though minor, revealed the undercurrent of protective pride the villagers held for their home and its routines. Hamish's eyes swept over the scene, cataloguing nuances. Each misstep, hesitation and glance was a potential clue in the human puzzle of Loch Dhu. "And how long before we can make a statement?" Daviot asked, hands fidgeting with his notebook. Voice edging toward impatience. Hamish let a beat pass. "When I have a clear understanding," he said dryly. "Rushing leads only to mistakes." Luggs gave a low growl at Anderson's eager movement, and Hamish's lips twitched slightly. Bureaucrats could not grasp subtlety. They assumed control where empathy and observation were required. He led them a short distance along the quay, noting footprints partially washed by last night's drizzle. Broken reeds and scattered stones suggested someone had crossed the path hurriedly. Hamish paused, letting the fog curl between them, and observed Daviot's sharp intake of breath, the tension in Anderson's shoulders. The officers were aware that something was amiss, but could not yet interpret the nuances that Hamish had long catalogued. A crofter emerged from a side path, broad-shouldered and wary, pausing mid-step. "What's all this, then?" he asked bluntly, voice low but firm. His eyes flicked from the officers to Hamish, evaluating, protective. Hamish gave a brief nod. "I'm following a lead, listening to observations." The crofter's lips pressed into a thin line, and he muttered something under his breath before moving on, posture tense. The slight defensiveness, the habitual caution, revealed hidden village grudges and the care villagers took in guarding knowledge from outsiders. Luggs sniffed at the damp stones along the loch, tail brushing waterlogged pebbles. Hamish crouched briefly, tracing footprints with a gloved hand. The impression suggested someone had paused, considered their route, then moved hurriedly onward. Nothing violent, nothing beyond minor inconvenience, yet the subtleties told a story that no form or report could capture. The wind shifted, curling mist around the officer's legs, and Hamish allowed a small, dry smile. The natural world, quiet and insistent, was the ultimate witness. Luggs barked softly at movement in the reeds, a trick of light and shadow, and Hamish straightened, eyes scanning the fog. Even here, amid procedural insistence, the village and the natural world, the truth waited patiently. Daviot exhaled, clearly uneasy. "You're certain nothing has been overlooked?" Hamish inclined his head. "I am certain I will notice what is important," he said. "Sometimes that is slow work, careful work, work that does not involve shouting or notebooks." Luggs nudged his hand, affirming that observation, patience, and understanding were sufficient allies. The officers muttered among themselves, shifting uneasily in the mist. Hamish allowed them their presence but did not accelerate, understanding that their impatience would only highlight errors. The crofters, the tourists, the hotel staff, all went about small routines, each glance, movement, and whisper reinforcing the web of human detail that Hamish relied upon. Pride, shame, subtle fear, and the protective instinct of Loch Dhu's residents provided more insight than any formal report ever could. By late morning, the fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the dark waters of Loch Dhu and the outline of cottages along the shore. Hamish and Luggs returned toward the village path, each step measured, every observation noted. Daviot and Anderson lagged behind, fussing over forms, glancing anxiously at the loch, unaware of the quiet narrative that Hamish had begun to assemble. Luggs padded beside him, ears alert, tail flicking. Hamish inhaled the chill, peat-scented air, feeling the weight of observation and the quiet responsibility that came with protecting both the truth and the village. He paused briefly at the corner where the Curry sisters whispered to each other, glancing at him with bright, curious eyes. A crofter passed silently, head tipped down, expression unreadable but watchful. Hamish felt the delicate balance of pride, secrecy, and vigilance pressing around him. Somewhere in the mist, the shadow the witness had described might be waiting, but he was content for now to allow the fog and the village to tell their story in increments, quietly and deliberately. The day's interference from Strathbane had created moments of tension, but Hamish's patience and empathy had transformed it into insight. Luggs nudged him gently, and he smiled faintly, looking toward the dark water curling along the shore. The village hummed softly around them, mist and peat smoke mingling with the low murmur of gossip and the distant clatter of carts. Hamish adjusted his coat and stepped forward, ready to follow the next clue, ready to listen, and ready to uncover the human truth hidden beneath the fog. The rain had returned by mid-morning, persistent and grey, soaking the streets of Loch Dhu and curling the edges of the mist around the hotel. Hamish Macbeth walked with Luggs at his side, boots squelching in puddles, the dog occasionally lifting a paw as if to protest the cold water. Peat smoke drifted from chimneys, carrying the familiar scent into the wet air. The hotel loomed ahead, slate roof dark and slick, windows reflecting pale light through sheets of drizzle. The village moved around it with quiet murmurs, crofters adjusting nets, fishers checking moorings, tourists pressing umbrellas over shoulders, and the curry sisters watching from their doorway, whispering in low tones. Hamish let his eyes take in every subtle gesture, the tilt of a head, the stiffness of a posture, the way a hand lingered on a railing. Back in the lobby, the familiar smell of polished wood and damp coats lingered, with a hint of freshly brewed tea from the cafe corner. Hamish's coat dripped on the mat as he removed his hat. Luggs shook himself, sending droplets skittering across the polished floor. Hamish's gaze swept the room, noting the hotel staff. Each movement, expression and glance was a potential clue. A young maid, pale and nervous, lingered near the reception desk, hands clutched tightly around a towel, eyes darting to the staircase and then to the guests. Her posture was tense, betraying unease despite the polite mask she wore. Hamish inclined his head gently. "Good morning," he said quietly. "I'm hoping for a few moments of your time about Mr. Withers." He allowed the pause to stretch, letting the words settle. The maid swallowed, nodding slightly, and led him to the corridor where the guest rooms lined the damp walls. Luggs padded silently behind, nostrils flaring, tail low, sensing tension in ways even Hamish did not need to articulate. The hotel owner appeared as they passed the reception again, a stiff man in his 50s with polite, controlled movements. "Detective Macbeth," he said, voice measured. "I trust you are being discreet." His eyes flicked toward the staff, then back at Hamish. There was pride in his vigilance and a hint of fear of scandal, of misinterpretation, of gossip spilling beyond the village. Hamish noted it quietly, cataloguing every nuance. In the corridor, Hamish asked questions gently, allowing each answer to reveal itself rather than pressing for confession. "When did Mr. Withers last leave his room yesterday?" he inquired, voice low and even. The maid's hands twisted the towel, eyes flicking upward. "Late afternoon, sir. He went for a walk along the loch path, that's all I saw." Her hesitation was slight but telling, a momentary pause that suggested she knew more than she let on. Hamish made a mental note. They moved to a sitting area by the window, where tourists were sipping weak tea, umbrellas resting at their sides, eyes wide at the storm outside. Hamish's gaze swept over them. One couple had lingered near the loch the previous day, curious, stiff, unable to disguise their interest. He filed their presence away, recognizing the potential for gossip and misdirection. Luggs shifted uneasily, ears pricked toward a hotel porter passing in the hallway, tail flicking. Hamish followed the dog's attention, noting the man's furtive glance and slight blanching when caught. Blair's arrival was comical. The officer burst in, coat flapping, boots dripping, and immediately began directing staff with loud instructions that made little sense in the hotel's subdued rhythm. "Macbeth, we need statements. Now, every last detail." He banged his notebook against the desk, startling a guest into spilling tea. Davitt followed with an anxious expression, muttering about procedure and protocol, while Anderson scuttled behind, nodding eagerly at every command. Hamish watched, dry amusement touching the edge of his lips. Their intrusion created an opportunity. While they fussed and misread the room, he could observe, question, and interpret freely. A small revelation emerged when Hamish returned to the corridor outside Mr. Withers' room. Luggs sniffed at the floor, growling softly near the door of a junior staff member. Hamish crouched, eyes narrowing. Something was off, subtle enough for anyone else to miss, but clear in the dog's reaction. Tension, hesitation, and perhaps an unspoken knowledge of the visitor's movements. Hamish noted the redirection in glances, the stiffness in posture, and the quickening heartbeat behind the polite mask. He returned to the sitting room and spoke quietly with the hotel owner. "I understand some of your staff had brief interactions with Mr. Withers yesterday," he asked, allowing his tone to suggest casual observation rather than accusation. The man nodded, tight-lipped. "Yes, nothing unusual, I assure you. They brought tea, showed him directions to the loch. Routine." His eyes betrayed subtle anxiety, however, pride and protective instinct layered over concern for reputation. Hamish listened, cataloguing small discrepancies between the official story and what he had observed elsewhere. The tourists, oblivious, stirred tension by asking polite questions about Mr. Withers' absence. Their awkward phrasing and stiff curiosity prompted quick, guarded responses from the staff, revealing layers of village pride, fear, and subtle envy. Hamish observed it all, noting the dynamics: the protective instinct of villagers, the rivalries simmering quietly, and the careful politeness that disguised sharp opinions. As he moved to the window, Hamish watched the loch through the rain-smeared glass. Shadows of distant trees, dark against the grey sky, suggested movement, perhaps a passer-by, perhaps nothing at all. A minor red herring presented itself. Someone had reported seeing Mr. Withers walking alone at dusk, cheerful, apparently intending to leave the village. Hamish filed it carefully, but the evidence lacked consistency. He doubted it, quietly, letting the observation sit among the other strands of human behaviour he was following. Priscilla's presence was a subtle echo in his mind. He thought briefly of her calm, restrained elegance, of the way she could read situations without urgency, and how her quiet composure contrasted with the flustered chaos of the hotel staff and the officials. He felt the gentle weight of the promise he had made to her, the private memory threading through his attention to the present puzzle. Luggs nudged his hand, a reminder that instinct, observation, and human empathy often revealed more than procedure ever could. By late morning, Hamish had assembled a tentative picture: financial tensions between staff and management, subtle jealousies over guests, and concealed relationships that might explain small evasions. Village gossip, half-spoken and overheard in corners, hinted at rivalries and long-held grudges. The hotel itself, ordinary and familiar, contained more than its polished surfaces suggested. Each person's minute gestures, lip-biting, averted eyes, a hand pressed briefly to the chest, spoke volumes when interpreted against the rhythms of the village and the nuances of human pride. Blair, meanwhile, misinterpreted a casual remark as evidence, barking instructions that drew Luggs's low growl. Hamish smiled faintly, masking quiet satisfaction. The officer's blundering incompetence allowed him to move unobtrusively, to ask precise questions without interruption, and to observe human reactions unfiltered by bureaucracy. Every moment, every pause, every subtle reaction added to the emerging mosaic of truths. The rain began to lessen, light slanting through grey clouds, and Hamish moved toward the stairwell, Luggs padding silently beside him. Staff and guests resumed muted routines, the hum of quiet activity providing a backdrop for observation. The subtle interplay of pride, embarrassment, secrecy, and protective instinct continued to reveal itself in gestures, glances, and half-uttered phrases. Hamish catalogued each, understanding that the smallest human detail might carry the weight of motive or misdirection. He paused near the window overlooking the loch. Water rippled, faintly grey and reflective, mist curling along the edges, and he allowed himself a quiet breath. Luggs nudged his leg, ears swivelling, alert to movement in the corner of the room. Hamish's mind worked in measured, careful increments, assembling the human puzzle piece by piece. The hotel, the village, the mist, and the faint smell of wet peat all provided context and clarity. The missing visitor's story was unfolding slowly, and he was listening, watching, and noting every whisper, hesitation, and glance. The day's investigation had begun to reveal secrets hidden in plain sight: pride, jealousy, and protective instincts interwoven with the patterns of ordinary life. Hamish felt the familiar blend of melancholy and satisfaction as he allowed himself a final look at the hotel and the loch beyond. The threads of gossip, observation, and human emotion were knitting themselves into an understanding that would soon, carefully, point toward the truth. Lugg settled at his feet, tail brushing the damp floor, and Hamish adjusted his coat, the weight of quiet contemplation pressing gently alongside the damp, misted air. By late afternoon the weather had turned abruptly. The Highland sky darkened as if a great curtain had been drawn over Loch Dhu, the loch itself taking on a dark, restless sheen. Hamish Macbeth walked along the wet cobbles with lugs close to his heels, boots splashing through puddles, coat damp against his skin. The wind whipped along the quay, tugging at coat hems and tossing loose hair into his eyes. Midges swarmed in small, persistent clouds, and the faint tang of salt from the loch mingled with the ever-present peat smoke drifting from chimneys. It was the sort of storm that isolated a village, dampened the spirits of visitors, and heightened the careful attention of its residents. Hamish paused, squinting into the thickening mist. Lugs growled softly, hackles raised, ears pricked toward the west where the first flash of distant lightning illuminated the darkening sky. He bent slightly, patting the dog's head. "Steady, boy. Nothing yet." Even the wind, carrying the smell of wet earth in the loch, seemed to whisper caution. Villagers moved hurriedly indoors, crofters clutching coats, fishers gathering nets, tourists scuttling beneath umbrellas. The Curry sisters peeked through their doorway, eyes wide, murmuring to each other with fingers pressed over lips. Each glance, each gesture, carried the weight of gossip, protective instinct, and long-held grudges. Hamish ducked under the hotel awning, letting the rain pelt the cobbles behind him. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of damp wool and hot tea, mingled with the faint bleach of freshly cleaned floors. The staff moved quietly, avoiding unnecessary words while still maintaining the polite routine that masked tension. He observed the maid wiping counters with nervous precision, eyes flicking toward the staircase as if aware of secrets she was not ready to speak aloud. Hamish inclined his head slightly, a gentle greeting, letting the subtle tension of the room reveal what words could not. "Storm's coming down proper," murmured the hotel owner, voice low, eyes narrowing at the windows. "Best we keep everyone inside, eh?" Hamish nodded, taking in the concern, the pride, and the faint fear that coloured his careful politeness. Lugg sniffed near the door, tail low, ears twitching. The dog always sensed what Hamish might overlook, a shift in mood, a ripple of unease in human behaviour. Hamish moved to a corner chair, wet coat brushing against the polished wood, and pulled his notebook from his coat pocket. He reviewed the small observations collected over the past days. Footprints, evasions, half-spoken statements. Each piece fit into the puzzle slowly, the storm outside lending a rhythm to thought. Rain rattled on the roof, wind howled through the eaves, and for a few quiet minutes the villagers' pulse slowed to match the weather. Even Blair and Daviot had been delayed by washed-out roads, and Anderson had returned to headquarters by phone, frustrated at the isolation. The lull allowed private conversations to surface. Crofters huddled near the fireplace, voices low but audible to Hamish, admitting minor details. Someone had moved a boat last night, a lantern had been left unattended on the loch path. Small omissions that spoke of pride, embarrassment, and the instinct to protect one's own. Hotel staff, relieved of the immediate presence of officious officers, murmured resentments and rivalries. Shifts poorly assigned, tips disputed, subtle animosity toward guests whose wealth or manners clashed with local sensibilities. Hamish listened quietly, letting the natural flow of words reveal truths that documents could never capture. A sudden clap of thunder shook the window panes, startling Lugs into a small whine. Hamish patted the dog's head, noting how the storm's energy seemed to make even his faithful companion uneasy. The wind rattled shutters, and a gust carried the scent of wet peat through the lobby. Hamish allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The storm isolated the village and forced matters inward. It revealed character, tested composure, and created opportunities for truths to emerge through observation rather than interrogation. Near the fireplace, a villager shifted uneasily. Hamish noticed the glance toward the hotel entrance, the half-fearful posture. "You saw something near the loch last night?" Hamish asked softly, voice casual but attentive. The villager hesitated, fingers tightening on the arm of the chair. I think so," he admitted, tone low, eyes darting toward the corners of the room. His pride kept him from speaking fully, but the partial confession was enough to suggest a location where the visitor might have lingered, unseen by others. Hamish made a note, allowing the subtle interplay of fear, embarrassment, and protective instinct to guide his interpretation. Blair reappeared mid-afternoon, boots soaked, hair flattened by wind, coat lopsided. He stamped through the lobby, flapping notebooks and issuing instructions loudly. "We need details, every move, statements now!" His voice cracked over the storm's background, startling a guest into spilling tea. Daviot followed, glancing nervously at windows, muttering about protocol and proper procedure. Hamish allowed the officers their presence, smiling faintly at their comic incompetence. Their bluster created space for him to observe freely, unobtrusively, to question with empathy while the bureaucrats misread the situation entirely. Luggs growled once at Blair's approach, tail stiff, confirming that caution was appropriate even in the cosy bounds of village life. Hamish returned to the small table near the window, lifting his notebook. Observations collected over days were reviewed and weighed, inconsistencies noted. The visitor's supposed evening stroll, the half-glimpsed shadow on the loch path, the hotel staff's nervous glances. Red herrings emerged naturally, including a hurriedly whispered account of Mr. Withers departing voluntarily, which Hamish filed but quietly doubted. Each human reaction, hesitation, and half-smile held weight, illuminating motive, opportunity, and subtle deception. Outside, the storm rattled the slate roof, wind bending trees toward the loch. Rainwater cascaded along gutters, and the mist mixed with fine spray from the waves. Hamish allowed himself a brief look toward the water, imagining the visitor's path, the interactions of villagers, and the hidden movements that had gone unnoticed. Luggs pressed close to his side, shivering slightly, ears swiveling to capture every nuance of sound. The storm was more than weather. It was an amplifier of human behavior, revealing what people thought they could hide and what the elements exposed in silence. By late afternoon, voices had settled into quieter tones. Crofters returned indoors, villagers paused in half-timid discussions, and tourists watched the loch from covered doorways. Hamish moved gently among them, asking a few questions, listening more. The storm created the perfect conditions for revelations. Embarrassment, jealousy, and protective instinct emerged naturally, unguarded by the watchful eyes of officials who were now absent or hampered by washed-out roads. As twilight approached, the storm began to ease. Rain pattered softly against windows. The wind diminished to gusts that bent only the smaller branches of trees. Hamish stepped toward the loch briefly, Luggs at his side, ears alert to movement along the dark water's edge. Shadows and reflections played across the surface, shifting with the remaining mist. He noted patterns, small details, and the faintest suggestion of footprints along the quayside, barely visible in the dim light. The village, trapped indoors for hours, had revealed secrets, tensions, and truths through whispers, posture, and the careful phrasing of words. Hamish felt the quiet satisfaction of patient observation, empathy, and gentle manipulation. Luggs nudged his hand, and he allowed himself a small smile. The storm had passed enough to let him glimpse the human threads woven through Loch Dhu, each subtle cue a step closer to understanding the visitor's disappearance. He turned back toward the village proper, boots squelching softly, rain dripping from coat and hat, Luggs padding silently beside him. Windows glowed with flickering lights, peat smoke drifted lazily through the narrowing streets, and the low hum of conversation mixed with the remnants of the storm. Hamish inhaled the cold, peat-laden air once more, allowing the steady rhythm of village life, human observation, and gentle, careful reflection to settle around him. Somewhere, in the shadows and whispers, the next piece of the puzzle waited. Night had fallen over Loch Dhu with sudden thoroughness, the sky a uniform grey-black, fog curling across the village like a slow, deliberate tide. Hamish Macbeth moved along the shoreline, Luggs close at his side, paused silent on wet stones. The scent of peat smoke drifted faintly from chimneys, mingling with the damp, earthy tang of the loch. The wind carried whispers of last evening's rain, shifting shadows across the narrow paths and making the creaking of jetties sound sharper, more insistent. Hamish inhaled deeply, drawing the chill into his lungs, letting it sharpen his senses as he approached the small, secluded cabin at the far end of the loch, the one he had glimpsed from a distance during the day. Luggs stopped, ears erect, body tense, tail brushing the ground in short, alert sweeps. Hamish crouched slightly, hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured. The cabin was dark, windows shuttered, its silhouette merging with the fog. Nothing moved, and yet Lugs's unease was unmistakable. Hamish's eyes scanned the perimeter, footprints leading toward the loch, faint impressions in the soft mud near a small makeshift jetty, and the subtle evidence of someone having hurriedly crossed from the main path. The signs were slight, almost negligible to anyone less attentive, but Hamish catalogued them carefully. He approached the door, noting the absence of forced entry. The cabin was ordinary in appearance, yet the air surrounding it seemed taut with tension. Hamish considered the village stories, the contradictions he had noted among crofters, hotel staff, and even tourists. Each half-truth, each hesitation, now coalesced into a pattern. Pride, embarrassment, and fear of gossip had led to omissions and misdirections, and it was in these small human details that he began to see the outlines of the visitor's presence. A soft scuff of foot against the cabin floor made Lugs bristle, hackles rising. Hamish's own pulse quickened slightly, the thrill of quiet vigilance pressing at the edges of his calm exterior. He moved to the side of the cabin, voice low and unobtrusive. "I don't mean to startle anyone," he murmured, letting the words carry a subtle authority rather than force. Silence answered him, broken only by the distant lap of water against stones and the wind shifting through reeds. He allowed the pause to stretch, observing, listening, noting each minor detail, a faint reflection in the window, a shifted chair, a loose shutter hinge rattling softly. From the fog behind him came a distant, half-muffled voice, a villager perhaps, testing the cover of darkness. Hamish did not respond, instead allowing the unseen observer to reveal themselves through movement and tone. He recalled the subtle avoidance he had seen in prior conversations, the careful choice of words, the body language of those reluctant to speak fully. Each micro-expression, every small gesture of pride, shame, or protective instinct became evidence in itself. Hamish crouched near a side window, peering through the dim glass. Lugs pressed close, alert and silent, tail brushing the damp floorboards. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, and calculated, echoed faintly across the wooden floor. Hamish's hand rested lightly on the doorframe, ready to steady himself should the situation shift unexpectedly. A loose board creaked under his own weight, a brief, inconsequential sound, yet enough to hint at potential risk if mismanaged. He paused, adjusting his footing to avoid drawing attention, mindful of the cozy scale danger inherent in a misstep. Inside the cabin, faint signs indicated recent occupation. A folded coat draped over a chair, the smell of faintly burned peat lingering in a small stove, and a chair slightly angled as if someone had left in a hurry. Hamish catalogued each observation in quiet mental notes, building a picture of the visitor's presence and movement without disturbing a thing. Lugs's nose twitched, tail low but stiff, as if confirming the validity of Hamish's deductions. As Hamish shifted focus back to the village, he reflected briefly on Priscilla, elegant and restrained, far away in the city. The promise he had made to her pressed gently at his thoughts, personal loyalty intertwined with professional duty, observing human nature, understanding hidden motivations, and protecting the village's secrets were all aspects of that quiet responsibility. Lugs nudged his hand, a small reminder of companionship and reassurance, grounding him in the present as he considered the subtleties of motive and opportunity. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest sound of movement along the loch's edge. Hamish moved slightly, noting the subtle shift in shadows and light as fog thickened. One villager's fear had already hinted at a location the visitor might have taken refuge. Hamish considered it, weighting it against the half-truths and careful omissions he had observed over the past days. Pride, embarrassment, and the need to protect one's own had influenced every account he had gathered. Now, in the stillness of night, those human elements were more visible, their outlines sharper against the fog and muted light. A sudden, brief creak from the cabin floorboards startled Lugs, who whined softly and moved closer to Hamish. The movement was minor, harmless, but it reminded Hamish of the fine line between observation and disturbance. He adjusted his footing again, ensuring neither he nor the dog made unnecessary noise. A small, cozy level danger existed, easily avoided, and Hamish managed it with quiet precision, his awareness stretched across both human and environmental cues. He returned his attention to the window, tracing the faint shapes beyond the mist, reeds bending under the wind, the loch dark and reflective, and the outlines of trees along the distant shore. Each movement, each subtle hint, reinforced the picture he had been building. Contradictions among villagers' stories now seemed coherent in outline. Timing, location, and hesitations all suggested deliberate obfuscation rather than malicious intent. Hamish catalogued these details, forming a web of probability and human behaviour that did not rely on physical evidence alone. Inside, the cabin remained silent, the faint smell of damp wood and smouldering peat settling around him. Lugs's ears rotated constantly, capturing the tiniest variations in sound. Hamish noted the careful way a shutter had been adjusted, the placement of furniture, the subtle alignment of objects, all suggesting the presence of someone who had attempted to maintain normality while remaining hidden. Observation, patience, and empathy revealed more than interrogation could. A soft gust rattled the cabin, and Hamish exhaled quietly, sensing the completion of a pattern. The visitors' movements, the villagers' half-truths, and the environmental cues all aligned, pointing toward understanding. Lugs pressed close, a reassuring presence. Hamish allowed himself a brief smile, feeling the calm satisfaction of methodical work. The night, thick with fog and damp, had isolated the village and heightened perception, yet all danger had remained subtle, cosy, and well within control. As he prepared to leave, Hamish cast one last glance at the loch, the fog curling like smoke around the dark water, reflections shifting softly in the muted light. The village lay quiet beyond the cabin, each cottage a muted glow of warmth, peat smoke curling from chimneys, and shadows moving gently in the windows. Observation, careful deduction, and gentle manipulation of human behaviour had illuminated the path, and Hamish felt the quiet certainty that the threads were beginning to tie together. He adjusted his coat, patted Lugs, and turned toward the faint path leading back to the village. The fog rolled in around them once more, embracing the loch and the moors, yet Hamish walked with calm purpose. Somewhere within the shadows and half-truths of Loch Dhu, the next clue waited, and he would find it in time. The night had revealed what the day could not, and the village's quiet resilience, human complexity, and subtle secrets promised that the investigation's next step would come naturally from careful attention and gentle observation. The morning had arrived grey and damp, mist curling over the loch and through the narrow streets of Loch Dhu, softening edges and muffling footsteps. Hamish Macbeth moved along the quay with Lugs padding faithfully beside him, boots squelching in puddles, coat damp but comfortable against the chill. The air carried the familiar mingling of wet peat and salt, stirring memories of quieter walks along the moors and the long afternoons he had spent considering the village's subtle rhythms. Lugs paused, ears twitching, tail low but alert, sniffing the air as if to confirm that all was as it should, or should not, be. Hamish allowed himself a brief glance over the village rooftops, noting the curling smoke from chimneys and the movement of early risers. Crofters were already tending nets near the loch, fishers adjusting lines, and Patel had opened his shop, baskets lined neatly outside, the scent of fresh bread and mild spices drifting faintly. The Curry sisters peered from their doorway, glances flicking toward him, murmuring softly. Hamish smiled faintly, appreciating the subtle undercurrent of village gossip that carried truths, half-truths, and deliberate misdirections all at once. He paused by the hotel, observing the staff as they moved about, gestures precise and faces polite but tense. A maid wiped counters, eyes flicking toward the staircase, shoulders tight. The hotel owner, jaw slightly rigid, adjusted the strap of a delivery bag, sending a faint scuff of leather across the polished floor. Hamish noted every twitch, every hesitation, storing them quietly for later. Lugs sniffed toward the hall, emitting a low growl at a subtle movement near the service entrance. Hamish crouched slightly, following the dog's attention, noting the small but telling cues of unease. Blair and Daviot appeared then, striding in with all the energy of misplaced authority. Blair stamped boots across the wet mat, notebook banging against the desk. "We require answers, Macbeth," he barked. Davitt followed, adjusting his hat, muttering anxiously about procedure. Anderson hovered nearby, eyes wide, ready to write down anything he could. Hamish allowed them their presence, noting their impatience and clumsiness with quiet amusement. The officer's bluster created space for observation as the villagers instinctively shifted, careful not to upset the fragile balance of propriety and pride. Hamish moved toward a table near the window, lugs at his heels, tail brushing the damp floor. He opened his notebook, reviewing details gathered over the past days, observations of footprints, hesitant glances, misremembered times, and subtle evasions in conversation. Each detail, no matter how small, formed part of the web of human behavior he needed to untangle. Pride, jealousy, and financial interest all intertwined among villagers, hotel staff, and the occasional outsider, forming subtle motives that were easier to read when patience allowed patterns to emerge. A crofter passed by the window, hands tucked in coat pockets, eyes bright and cautious. Hamish inclined his head, voice quiet. "Morning. I wonder if you might help clarify something about last night." The man hesitated, glancing toward the lobby, lips pressed together. "I suppose... Well, I saw something by the loch," he admitted finally. The words were careful, measured, but the timing, the hesitation, revealed as much as the content. Luggs sniffed at the floor near Hamish's chair, tail flicking slightly in acknowledgement of the subtle cue. Hamish nodded, storing the information. He rose, walking slowly toward the reception desk, eyes scanning the movements of hotel staff. The maid's hands twisted a towel, fingers pale, posture stiff. The owner adjusted a stack of papers with deliberate care. Their gestures betrayed small resentments, minor jealousies, and protective instincts, elements as important as any physical clue. The tourists, oblivious, drifted along, asking polite but awkward questions that prompted furtive glances and whispered remarks. Hamish let them speak, noting every subtle reaction and storing it alongside more reliable observations. Returning to a small corner by the window, Hamish considered motives. Pride, the subtle need to assert status within the village, had clearly influenced who volunteered information and who remained silent. Jealousy, particularly among hotel staff and crofters, suggested why certain movements and interactions had been exaggerated or minimized. Financial motives were less apparent, but hinted at in half-spoken comments and the careful avoidance of specifics regarding Mr. Wither's presence or expected departure. Each possibility layered over the next, building a lattice of probability in human behavior that only careful attention could reveal. Blair, in his usual fashion, attempted to assert authority by pointing at random items of furniture and issuing loud directives. "We need to know if anything's missing," he demanded, voice sharp, boots scuffing. Davitt adjusted his tie nervously, muttering about protocol, while Anderson flitted from side to side, notebook open. Hamish allowed the intrusion to continue unchallenged, observing the officer's errors as they amplified the village's natural caution. Luggs growled softly at Blair, ears flat, tail stiff. Hamish patted the dog's head. "Easy, boy. They mean no harm." A key clue emerged in the form of a seemingly minor villager observation. A child had been playing near the loch the evening before, sighting a figure moving quickly along the jetty. The description was vague, yet the precise location, direction of movement, and hesitation revealed more than any adult's account. Hamish crouched, quietly asking questions that allowed the observer to recount the memory without pressure, and from these subtle details he resolved earlier ambiguities about timing and presence. Luggs pressed close, sensing Hamish's quiet focus. Hamish allowed himself a brief reflection on Priscilla, restrained and elegant, far away in the city. Her presence lingered in his thoughts, a quiet reminder of promises and loyalty beyond the immediate investigation. He drew a gentle breath, focusing on the human patterns before him, and let the subtle warmth of memory settle alongside the wet chill of the hotel lobby. Empathy and strategic observation intertwined, guiding him in discerning truth from omission, honesty from protective deception. By afternoon, the storm outside had settled into a fine drizzle, fog curling along the loch and creeping along the streets. The villagers had returned indoors, huddled by fires or sipping tea at tables, whispering half-truths and speculations that Hamish catalogued quietly. Each glimmer of pride, hesitation, and social posturing became a vital piece of the puzzle, revealing motives and contradictions in ways that paperwork never could. Blair fumed silently in the corner, unable to impose control, while Davitt fussed with pen and paper, unaware of the insights Hamish quietly gathered. Hamish reviewed the observations, piecing together patterns from Crofter's admissions, hotel staff evasions, tourists' inadvertent provocations, and Luggs's subtle alerts. He noticed who avoided certain topics, whose gaze lingered too long, and whose hands fidgeted with small objects. All were human cues: pride, shame, protective instinct, or embarrassment. The visitor's disappearance remained unsolved, but the outlines of motive, opportunity, and misdirection were becoming clear. As twilight approached, Hamish moved to the window overlooking the loch. The fog thickened once more, curling over the dark water, reflecting dim light from the village. Luggs pressed close, ears swivelling, tail brushing the damp floor. Hamish exhaled slowly, allowing himself to feel the quiet satisfaction of progress. Observation, careful listening, and empathy had revealed much more than any officious report could. The threads of human behaviour, gossip, and village dynamics had begun to tie together. He adjusted his coat and patted Luggs, preparing to continue the next steps of his quiet investigation. The hotel, the loch, the village, and the lingering fog all held secrets yet to be revealed, but Hamish felt certain that patience, discretion, and careful attention would uncover the remaining truths. Somewhere within the half-spoken whispers, the subtle gestures, and the protective instincts of Loch Dhu, the visitor's path was waiting to be traced. Mist clung stubbornly to Loch Dhu that evening, curling around rooftops and drifting in slow, deliberate waves over the dark water. Hamish Macbeth walked along the wet quay with Luggs at his heels, the dog's ears swivelling at every subtle sound. The air was sharp with salt and peat smoke, and the faint drizzle made the cobbles slippery underfoot. The village was quiet, subdued by the fading light and the sense of anticipation that even the mist seemed to carry. Hamish drew in a slow breath, allowing the chill to sharpen his senses as he considered the day's careful observations, the myriad half-truths he had collected, and the subtle patterns of human behaviour that pointed toward resolution. He reached the hotel, where a few of the villagers had gathered in the lounge, chairs arranged with casual deliberation around the peat fire. The light flickered against damp wood, casting shadows that shifted gently with the flames. Crofters leaned back, arms crossed, expressions guarded but curious. Hotel staff hovered politely at the edges, eyes bright with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Tourists, umbrellas still wet from the quayside, whispered among themselves, unaware of the subtleties around them. Hamish paused at the door, adjusting his frayed coat, Luggs sniffing the air and giving a soft, low growl. The dog's alertness mirrored Hamish's own. Tension threaded through the room, unspoken but palpable. Blair and Davitt had arrived, late as usual, dripping and frowning. Blair stomped boots across the floor, muttering about procedure, while Davitt fussed over a notebook he carried with him as though the act of writing might impose order on the room. Anderson hovered behind, eager, scribbling half-legible notes. Hamish allowed them their presence, eyes briefly noting the misplaced sense of authority and the faint frustration curling in the villagers' expressions. Their interference, minimal though it was, provided opportunities to guide the proceedings subtly, allowing him to orchestrate a quiet confrontation without embarrassment to those gathered. Hamish cleared his throat softly, drawing attention without raising his voice. "I thank you all for coming. We've gathered information carefully over the past days," he said, voice measured and calm. "And while many details have been offered in good faith, there remain contradictions that require clarification." He paused, letting the words settle, watching the way hands twisted, eyes flicked, and posture shifted. Luggs pressed closer to his side, tail brushing the floor, ears swivelling at the faint creak of a shutter or the distant lap of water against the quay. He gestured gently toward the loch. "Mr. Withers, the visitor who has concerned us all, has been located, though his absence raised questions worthy of our attention." A ripple passed through the room, half relief, half curiosity. Crofters shifted uneasily, hotel staff straightened, and the Curry sisters exchanged quick, pointed glances. Hamish allowed the pause to extend, noting the subtle interplay of pride and shame, relief and tension. A young hotel maid stepped forward, voice small, hesitant. "Sir, he's safe, isn't he?" She glanced nervously at the others, hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. Hamish inclined his head. "Yes, safe, though perhaps not entirely free of inconvenience. His disappearance, brief as it was, arose from circumstance, human error, and miscommunication rather than malice or mischief." Luggs emitted a soft whine, sensing the quiet tension in the group, and Hamish patted the dog's head lightly. Blair, already flustered, leapt forward. "I demand details," he barked, notebook held like a shield. "We must record every action, every motive." His voice cracked over the low hum of conversation. Hamish allowed a faint smile, dry and unspoken, as he guided the room's attention with calm subtlety rather than force. He had long learned that human nature revealed itself best under gentle observation, not coercion. Turning toward a cluster of villagers near the hearth, Hamish spoke softly. "Some of you observed movements, others offered information. Each has been valuable. Yet there remain questions about the inconsistencies in accounts. Pride, embarrassment, and protective instincts have coloured details, as they often do." A crofter straightened, arms crossing tightly, lips pressing together. Hamish noted the tension, understanding that grudges and the desire to shield one's own could mask truth. He moved closer to the hearth, hands folded calmly, voice still quiet. "Through careful observation, I've determined that Mr. Withers's disappearance was unintentional, a series of small choices leading him to a secluded spot along the loch. Human error, minor misdirection, and some reluctance to admit embarrassment contributed to concern, though nothing was done with malice." Luggs twitched, ears alert, tail brushing the floor once more. Hamish allowed the dog's subtle cues to reinforce the observations, noting where attention and anxiety concentrated in the room. The true culprit emerged not from action, but from psychological misstep. A hotel staff member, pale, hands twisting a towel, eyes avoiding direct contact, revealed in a careful slip the final piece, a misdirected explanation intended to cover minor negligence, a detail overlooked by everyone else. Hamish observed quietly, noting the shift in posture, the quickening of breath, and the subtle avoidance of eye contact. The revelation required no accusation, no dramatic confrontation, just the gentle alignment of observation with human behaviour. Blair, oblivious, misread the staff member's hesitancy as threat or deceit. He stamped a foot, voice raised. "Now see here, we must—" Hamish cut him off with a quiet hand, voice soft but firm. "Patience, officer. Observation will reveal more than shouting." The officer froze, blinking, flustered. Davitt adjusted his tie nervously, muttering under his breath, while Anderson scuttled in place, eager but ineffective. Luggs let out a soft sigh of relief, as if confirming the absence of true danger. Hamish turned back to the group, voice calm and precise. The circumstances were minor, human, and entirely resolvable. No harm was done. Pride, embarrassment, and minor concealments were the sources of concern, not malice. The visitor is safe, and the village need not fear scandal. The room exhaled collectively, relief, satisfaction, and the subtle humour of a situation carefully diffused without humiliation. He glanced briefly at the mist rolling along the loch, the faint ripple of wind through reeds, the distant creak of a jetty. The Highland weather mirrored the conclusion, melancholic, still powerful, yet ultimately calm. Luggs pressed against his leg, tail brushing gently, ears swivelling toward every subtle movement. Hamish allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection, the weight of duty, empathy, and the promise to protect both the village and Priscilla threading through his thoughts. A crofter finally spoke, voice low but firm. "So, it was just mistakes then?" Pride softened slightly, embarrassment acknowledged, and the truth accepted. Hamish inclined his head. "Precisely. Mistakes and minor misjudgments, nothing more." The hotel staff exhaled, their tension easing, and the villagers allowed themselves faint smiles. The careful management of human behaviour, combined with observation and gentle questioning, had revealed truth without recrimination. Blair muttered under his breath, disgruntled, while Davitt adjusted his notebook, still uncertain how to capture a resolution that relied on subtlety rather than formality. Hamish watched quietly, noting the humour in the juxtaposition, officious officials floundering while the human puzzle resolved itself under patient, empathetic observation. Lugs gave a small bark, tail flicking, signalling that the tension had ebbed. As the evening deepened, the mist thickened once more, curling low along the loch, weaving through rooftops and cobbled streets. Hamish moved to the window, Lugs at his side, tail brushing gently, ears alert. Reflections shimmered across the dark water, shadows bending with the faint wind. Hamish allowed the quiet melancholy to settle over him, relief for the visitor, satisfaction in the careful unravelling of human complexity, and the soft, enduring warmth of the village's protective spirit. He glanced at Priscilla's absence from his thoughts, elegant and restrained, far away yet present in memory. The promise he had made lingered, a quiet tether to personal loyalty interwoven with professional duty. He adjusted his coat, patted Lugs, and allowed the last light of the fading evening to settle over the village. The mist, the loch, and the quiet streets seemed to acknowledge the resolution, folding the day into the calm melancholy of Highland night. The visitor, once missing, was accounted for, motives clarified, misdirections resolved, and tensions diffused without harm or humiliation. Hamish's careful observation, patient questioning, and subtle manipulation of human behaviour had preserved the dignity of the villagers while uncovering the truth. Lugs pressed closer, warm and attentive, and Hamish allowed himself a faint smile, noting the balance of duty, empathy, and human understanding that had carried him through. Outside, the fog rolled thicker along the loch, the wind sighing through reeds and bending branches. Inside, the fire flickered low, and shadows stretched along polished floors and damp stone. The village exhaled gently, a quiet acknowledgement of resolution and the subtle humour of human pride laid bare, yet protected from exposure. Hamish adjusted his coat, patted Lugs once more, and allowed the last warmth of the peat fire and the subtle melancholy of the Highland night to enfold him. The morning light was pale and misted, curling lazily over Loch Dhu, softening the outlines of rooftops and blending the loch into the distant hills. Hamish Macbeth walked along the quay with Lugs at his side, boots squelching in puddles left from overnight rain, the dog's nose twitching at the familiar mix of salt and peat smoke. The village was quieter than usual, the kind of calm that followed a disturbance. Small glances exchanged between crofters, fishers lingering by nets longer than necessary, and tourists moving cautiously, uncertain where to look or how to act. Hamish breathed in the damp air, letting it sharpen his senses and provide the rhythm for reflection. Lugs padded beside him, tail low, ears alert, sensing the unspoken tension still lingering beneath the surface of everyday life. Inside the hotel, the lobby smelled faintly of wet wool and polished wood, with peat smoke drifting in through open doors. The hotel staff moved quietly, arranging towels, straightening chairs, and refilling teapots, their movements precise but tinged with the relief of resolution. Hamish watched them from the doorway, noting how even in the return to routine, small gestures, tightened shoulders, cautious glances, fingers pressed briefly to lips, revealed the ongoing navigation of pride, embarrassment, and careful social balance. Lugs whined softly at a distant creak in the floor, ears pricked, tail brushing against Hamish's leg. Hamish inclined his head slightly, reassuring the dog. "Easy, boy," he murmured, voice low, observing and cataloguing in silence. Blair and Daviot arrived just then, tripping over the threshold and dripping from the rain-soaked streets. Blair stamped boots loudly, notebook clattering, face red with frustration. "We need to record this. Every move," he barked. Daviot fussed with pen and paper, muttering nervously about protocol. Anderson followed, scribbling in a scrawled frenzy, eager to appear useful. Hamish allowed the trio to make their entrance, noting the comic contrast between their officious concern and the quiet, practical recovery of the village. He had long learned that bureaucracy often provided opportunity. While officials fumbled, he could observe, interpret, and maintain equilibrium. Lugs growled low at Blair, hackles raised, and Hamish patted the dog's head. "Nothing to worry about, boy. Just noise." Crofters began emerging from homes, shifting nets and tools, adjusting coats, each movement carrying a subtle measure of cautious relief. Villagers glanced at each other, polite smiles masking pride, grudges, and curiosity, as if negotiating silently who would speak first and what could be safely revealed. Hamish noticed these small signals: half-tilted heads, tightened lips, brief exchanges of eyes, and understood their weight. Pride, protection, and the habitual care of one's reputation shaped the way words and gestures were given. It was in these subtle dynamics that the village revealed more about itself than any formal statement ever could. Hamish moved to a chair near the peat fire, lugs curling at his feet, tail brushing the worn floorboards. The dog exhaled a small sigh, ears twitching at distant footsteps. Hamish removed wet boots and rested them on a small mat near the hearth, the warmth of the fire beginning to dry the leather. Steam rose from the mug of tea he carried, scent mingling with the smoky warmth of the hearth. He allowed himself a quiet moment, observing the village settling back into its rhythm. Tea poured, chairs adjusted, glances exchanged, and whispers of gossip that now carried less urgency and more measured amusement. He reflected on human nature in the village, on pride softened by relief, grudges simmering without explosion, and the subtle humour that always threaded itself through tense moments. Lugs pressed against him, warm and content, mirroring the calm that had returned. Hamish considered the promise he had made to Priscilla, elegant and restrained, and the quiet influence her presence had on his sense of duty and integrity. Observing the village in this moment reinforced the balance he had worked to maintain: human dignity preserved, social harmony restored, and truth revealed with care rather than force. A crofter approached, boots still damp, hands tucked into coat pockets, expression wary yet softened by the morning's resolution. "You've done well, Macbeth," he said, voice low, careful. "Things are as settled as they'll ever be." Hamish inclined his head, noting the mixture of pride, relief, and lingering caution. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It's good that the village can rest easy again." The crofter nodded, glancing briefly at Lugs, who wagged a tail lazily in acknowledgement, and moved on. At the hotel, staff resumed duties, exchanging quiet smiles and murmurs about the previous day's tension. A maid adjusted the placement of towels, hands still trembling slightly from nerves, while the owner straightened chairs and adjusted papers, shoulders easing from the stiffness of concern. Hamish observed the interactions, cataloguing the small measures of reconciliation, amusement, and human imperfection that now defined the hotel's atmosphere. Lugs twitched, ears rotating, and Hamish allowed a faint smile at the dog's ever-alert attention. Blair muttered under his breath, attempting to assert control over what remained of the hotel's routine. "We should record statements," he said again, voice faintly cracking. Daviot nodded nervously, adjusting his pen. Hamish let them speak, noting the humour inherent in the contrast between their officiousness and the gentle, organic restoration of the village. No one took them seriously, and that, in turn, allowed the villagers to relax further, without embarrassment or awkward confrontation. The mist thickened along the loch outside, curling among rooftops and across the quayside. Hamish rose, glancing through the rain-specked window. Reflections shimmered in the dark water, ripples bending under the faint wind. Small boats rocked gently at moorings, nets swaying with the motion, and the faint murmur of crofters' conversations reached him through the mist. Each sound, each movement, carried subtle signals of human behaviour, confirming that equilibrium had returned, yet that the village remained alert, protective, and aware of its own rhythm. He returned to his chair by the fire, Lugs settling at his feet, tail flicking once or twice. Steam rose from his tea, the scent of peat smoke curling in slow, lazy spirals. Hamish allowed himself a quiet thought of Priscilla, her elegance, restraint, and the promise he had made. Observing the village's reaction, the gentle settling of tensions, and the soft resumption of routine reminded him of the delicate balance between professional duty and personal loyalty. Tourists wandered the streets with more confidence now, umbrellas tucked under arms, eyes wide with curiosity, but lacking the tension of the past days. Hamish noted their polite inquiries, half smiles and measured movements, cataloguing each as part of the village's broader social tapestry. The Curry sisters lingered briefly near the doorway, whispering softly to each other, a mixture of amusement and satisfaction in their expressions. Hamish allowed a small smile, appreciating the quiet, gentle humour threading through the village's subtle interactions. By late afternoon, the fire burned low but warm, casting long, flickering shadows across damp stone floors and worn wooden furniture. Hamish allowed Lugs to stretch, tail brushing the floor, and sipped his tea slowly, watching the village settle. The interplay of pride, shame, protection, and social grace had restored balance. Small grudges remained, of course, simmering quietly, but they were manageable now, softened by relief and understanding. Blair and Daviot prepared to leave, boots splashing lightly across the wet cobbles outside. Blair muttered complaints about procedure, authority, and paperwork, while Daviot fussed nervously with a notebook. Hamish allowed the humour to settle over him, noting the contrast between bureaucratic urgency and the natural rhythms of human resolution in Loch Dhu. Lugs wagged his tail once as the officers departed, and Hamish exhaled quietly, the calm returning fully. He glanced once more at the mist curling along the loch, the faint wind shifting reeds near the quayside, and the dark water reflecting the soft glow of the village lights. The visitor's story was resolved, social equilibrium restored, and the careful, empathetic work of observation had preserved dignity and integrity across the community. Hamish adjusted his coat, patted Lugs gently, and allowed the warmth of the peat fire, the scent of tea, and the calm of Loch Dhu to settle around him. Even in the quiet, he reflected on the lessons of the past days. Patience, empathy, and gentle manipulation of human behaviour revealed far more than haste or formal authority. Pride, jealousy, and protective instincts were as telling as footprints or half-spoken sentences. And in the soft melancholy of Highland evening, he felt the comforting rhythm of village life resuming its pace, secure under his quiet vigilance. The night settled over Loch Dhu with a gentle finality, mist curling low along the loch and around the darkened cottages. Hamish Macbeth sat in his chair by the peat fire, the flames casting a soft, flickering light over the worn wooden floor and the small table cluttered with mugs, papers, and half-read notebooks. Lugs lay curled at his feet, tail brushing the floor, ears occasionally twitching as the dog listened to the familiar, comforting sounds of the settling village, a door creaking, distant footsteps, the low murmur of conversation behind closed windows. The air was cool, scented with peat smoke and damp earth, carrying the faint tang of the loch, and Hamish breathed it in, letting it sharpen his thoughts even as it eased his mind. The events of the past days had left their mark, subtle, persistent, and human. Hamish's eyes drifted to the window, where the loch shimmered faintly through the mist, its surface broken only by occasional ripples from the wind. The village beyond was quiet, the temporary stirrings of concern and gossip now softened into a muted rhythm. Crofters' cottages glowed warmly, small lights flickering behind curtains, while the occasional shadow suggested someone moving carefully about domestic chores. He noted, as always, the way people carried their pride, their grudges, and their protective instinct in each measured movement, each deliberate glance. Lugs shifted slightly, resting his head against Hamish's boot. "Quiet night," Hamish murmured. The dog's low growl was absent, the alertness softened into calm vigilance. Hamish allowed himself a faint smile, thinking of how Lugs mirrored his own sense of watchfulness, and now contentment. The village had been stirred, examined, and gently guided back toward equilibrium. No harm had come, and the balance of human dignity, curiosity, and gentle observation remained intact. Hamish sipped from a mug of tea, the warmth grounding him in domestic routine. The liquid was strong and smoky, a comfort after days of damp, mist, and long walks along the loch. He allowed his mind to wander, reviewing the threads of the investigation, the missing visitor, the subtleties of human behaviour, and the ways that pride, jealousy, and protective instinct had coloured each interaction. Villagers' half-truths and evasions had been neither malicious nor careless. They were the natural rhythms of a close-knit community, shaped by long-held grudges and the delicate balance of social standing. Through the haze of reflection, he thought of Priscilla Halberton Smythe, elegant and restrained, far away yet present in memory. The promise he had made to her weighed lightly but insistently in his chest. Her influence, subtle and quiet, had guided him in approaching the village with care, empathy, and discretion. In moments like this, solitude, hearth, and dog beside him, Hamish acknowledged how personal loyalty and professional duty intertwined, forming a quiet compass for action. He exhaled slowly, eyes softening as the firelight flickered across the walls. Outside, the loch whispered gently, the mist rolling in slow waves across the dark water. A faint wind lifted, bending reeds along the shoreline and rattling a loose shutter on a distant cottage. Hamish's gaze followed the movement, cataloguing the subtle shifts, knowing they reflected both natural rhythms and human occupation. Every detail was an echo of vigilance, observation, and understanding, the same lessons that had guided him through the village's recent disturbances. The hotel staff had long since retreated to their quarters, the crofters' chores were complete for the evening, and the tourists had tucked themselves into warm rooms. The village was calm, yet under the surface, the gentle pulse of gossip, pride, and curiosity persisted. Hamish reflected on how he had navigated these subtleties, listening without pressure, observing without intrusion, and guiding the truth forward with care rather than force. Each revelation had been a matter of patient empathy, subtle questioning, and the quiet reading of human nature. He glanced down at Lugs, whose ears twitched at a faint creak from the floorboards. The dog was alert, but relaxed, trusting Hamish's judgment and presence. Hamish reached down, resting a hand on Lugs's head. "We've done well, boy," he murmured. The comfort of routine, of warmth, and of companionship anchored the quiet melancholy of the night. He allowed himself a brief reflection on the gentle triumph of observation over conjecture, human understanding over bureaucracy. Blair and Daviot had long departed, tripping over wet cobbles and issuing last-minute complaints about procedure and authority. Their absence left only the organic rhythm of Loch Dhu, the village's resilience, and the faint echo of human curiosity and careful discretion. Hamish appreciated the understated humour of their presence and absence alike, noting the contrast between officious authority and the village's patient, observant culture. The fire crackled softly, sending small tongues of flame and embers curling toward the ceiling. Hamish adjusted his chair, letting the warmth seep into his damp coat and boots. He reviewed in thought the final reconciliations. Villagers' grudges softened, staff resentments acknowledged without embarrassment, and the visitor safely accounted for. Pride had been preserved, dignity maintained, and social equilibrium restored. Lugs shifted again, curling more tightly, tail brushing Hamish's foot, a quiet affirmation that the village and the hearth were safe. Hamish allowed his thoughts to drift further, considering the human elements that had shaped each outcome. Pride and shame, protection and misdirection, all had influenced behaviour. The delicate balance of disclosure and concealment had been navigated with subtlety, resulting in a resolution that preserved trust and dignity. Observation, empathy, and gentle manipulation had guided events more effectively than authority or paperwork ever could. Outside, the mist thickened along the loch, curling between cottages and creeping over the quayside. Hamish lifted his gaze to the faint glimmer of distant lights, noting the subtle reflections in the water, the slow, rhythmic motion of reeds, and the occasional movement of a lone bird returning to roost. Each small detail contributed to the overall picture of a village returning to calm, yet aware, responsive, and quietly alive. A cup of tea sat cooling on the table, the scent mingling with peat smoke and damp wood. Hamish picked it up, inhaling briefly before sipping, the warmth grounding him further. Lugs shifted once more, then settled fully, ears half-closed, tail tucked comfortably. The dog's presence reminded him of continuity, loyalty, and the simple comforts of home, a counterpoint to the human complexity he had navigated. Hamish allowed himself to acknowledge the quiet melancholy of resolution, the visitor safe, the village restored, and the threads of human behaviour laid bare and understood without harm or scandal. Pride, embarrassment, curiosity, and subtle humour had all played their roles. He reflected briefly on Priscilla, imagining her calm composure, elegance and insight, and how that subtle presence had guided him to act with care, discretion and integrity. The peat fire hissed softly, embers glowing faintly in the low light. Hamish tilted his chair slightly, letting the warmth seep into his damp coat and chilled skin. Outside, the loch reflected the misty, low-hanging clouds, its dark surface only broken by faint ripples from the light wind. Every sound, the distant clatter of shutters, the gentle splash of water against stones, the soft rustle of Lugs's fur, created a quiet harmony, a gentle accompaniment to thought and reflection. Hamish considered the lessons of the past days: observation, patience, empathy, and careful attention to human behaviour revealed truths that formal authority could not. Subtle motives, unspoken fears, and protective instincts all had been catalogued and reconciled, resulting in a peaceful, if quietly melancholic, resolution. Luggs shifted slightly, nudging Hamish's boot, and he allowed a small, contented smile. Outside, the mist thickened along the loch once more, curling between rooftops and softening edges. Inside, the fire continued to flicker, shadows stretching across polished wood and damp stone. The village had settled, the visitor accounted for, and social equilibrium restored. Hamish adjusted his chair, patted Luggs gently, and allowed the quiet domestic rhythm, the warmth of the fire, the smell of peat, the comfort of tea, to envelop him. The night was still, the air cool, and the loch whispered softly beyond the window. In that quiet, gentle melancholy, Hamish Macbeth reflected on human nature, the pride, the grudges, the curiosity, and the protective instincts that shaped every interaction. Observation, empathy, and subtle manipulation had guided events to their natural conclusion, and the village's dignity remained intact. Luggs shifted one final time, settling fully, tail brushing gently, ears relaxed. Hamish exhaled slowly, allowing himself to feel the warmth, the calm, and the quiet satisfaction of a case well observed and carefully resolved.